This month's safety video will align with the 2020 Excavation Stand Down Week, which is the 15th through the 19th of June. It's put on every year by MIOSHA to increase the awareness and the importance of trench and excavation safety. So here's some statistical data relating to construction fatalities and also excavation fatalities. So you can see that ultimately over the last 26 years, we've definitely been trending down. But if you look prior to 2007, we had some peaks upwards for total construction fatalities, just under 35, which is definitely unacceptable. Following 2007, you're looking at the excavation fatalities kind of stay steady at 1, maybe peaking at 2. And then we had a spike in 2016 for total construction fatalities, although the excavation fatalities remain unchanged. So ultimately, our goal is 0 for both construction fatalities and excavation fatalities, and that's what we need to strive for each year. Now we're going to take a look at some of the top violations that MIOSHA has cited over the last couple of years. The first being having a qualified person on the job site. We'll go into that further. Spoil piles, misdig, access and egress out of a trench run excavation, and also cave-in protection. So the first heavily cited violation is a qualified person. So that's just having a qualified person on site, having that qualified person understand their roles and responsibilities, and also that having that qualified person be able to perform routine inspections on any trench or excavation to check for evidence of any possible hazards, slides, or cave-ins, and be able to stop work in any of those situations that exist. You may have also heard of a competent person. The two terms, qualified and competent persons, are synonymous. OSHA uses the competent person term, and MIOSHA uses the qualified person term. At the end of the day, it's just important for the qualified person to always be on site to be able to perform these inspections, but also if any type of inspection were to be completed by MIOSHA, that person needs to be able to identify themselves as the qualified person on site who is able to carry out their roles and responsibilities. The next heavily cited violation is spoil piles. This should also include any type of materials and equipment that are also present on the job site or near an excavation. It is vitally important that these spoil piles, any materials and equipment, remain 2 feet from the excavation edge. This is to prevent any of the spoil pile from entering back into the excavation, or any materials and equipment falling into the excavation where workers may be present. It is important to always measure if you're unsure and maintain that 2 feet at all times. Next, we're going to talk about MISDIG 811, also known as Public Act 174. And this requires any company or any persons to contact the MISDIG system via 811 3 days prior to any excavation to have all of the public utilities marked so they're able to be exposed and not damaged. This is not only for the safety of the public, but this is also for the safety of the employees that are present on the job site. This is regulated, and compliance is assured through MIOSHA, but also through the MPSC. And because we work for the utilities, the MPSC does look at us heavily to ensure that we are following Public Act 174, that we're calling in tickets 3 days in advance of construction, but also that we're checking positive response to ensure that all public utilities in that area where the excavation is to be conducted have responded, and all utilities have been marked. So having access and being able to egress out of a trench or an excavation is one of the single most important things in trenching and excavation. It is required in any excavation or trench 4 feet or more in depth, but can be used in anything less than that. You know, when you're talking about trying to enter an excavation, if you're talking about uneven ground, it's better not to be jumping in or dropping into an excavation. It's better to properly go down the ladder and make safe entry into the excavation or trench. It's also important that, when you're talking about, lengthy trenches or excavations, that you have a way of access and egress not to exceed 25 feet. So you need to be within 25 feet of any ladder or ramp to be able to egress should any protective system fail or any of the trench or excavation conditions, soil conditions change. Cave-ins are responsible for the majority of fatalities from any trench or excavation. So it's important that we follow this rule to a T and that we ensure that we have a protective system in place in any excavation 5 feet or greater. It's not saying that if you have unstable soil less than 5 feet that you don't need a protective system, but this is the rule and this is what is regulated by MIOSHA. We've all been on job sites and seen other contractors put their employees at risk in excavations much greater than 5 feet with no protective system. We are definitely not that company, and that's not how we're going to conduct ourselves. So it is important that the qualified person on site ensures that if he has an excavation that's 5 foot or greater anywhere along the perimeter of the excavation, that we have a protective system in place and that it is used properly in accordance with the manufacturer's specifications. Okay, to review some of the things that we talked about and also to go over an easy way to remember the basic rules for excavation and trenching, we're going to go through the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rule. So the first is at least one qualified person must be present on a job site. This qualified person needs to understand their position, needs to be able to do routine inspections to make sure conditions do not become hazardous. And if they do, they need to call for the stop work or immediate egress out of the excavation or trench. Next is spoil piles, materials, and equipment shall remain 2 feet from the edge of an excavation or trench. This is pretty self-explanatory, and again, the 2 foot does not need to be encroached upon. Next, ladder shall extend at least 3 feet above the excavation or trench. If you're using a ladder as an egress point, you need to see 3 rungs outside the top of the excavation, and that will give you your 3 feet. And that is to be able to have a handhold when you're exiting onto the landing area outside of the excavation. Next, ladders are required in excavation or trenches greater than or equal to 4 feet. You need to have a way to egress if you're in a trench or excavation that is 4 foot or greater, but also any excavation that you feel like there's uneven ground, that you feel like a ladder will be safer to use, there's no harm in doing so. And then finally, protective systems such as benching, sloping, shoring, or shielding are required in excavations or trenches greater than or equal to 5 feet. Again, these protective systems are lifesavers and don't necessarily have to be used in any excavation that's less than 5 feet. But if you have any unstable conditions, it surely will help to ensure the safety of whoever is inside. So in conclusion, we are going to look at a video that was developed by MIOSHA and goes over all the protective systems and how they could have saved the workers in this real life scenario.
In the U.S., more than 800 construction workers die every year while on the job. One of the most dangerous types of construction work is trenching, which kills on average 40 workers every year. Workers can suffer death or serious injury within minutes of being caught in a trench cave-in. But these deaths can be prevented. The video you're about to see shows how quickly cave-ins lead to workers' deaths. The video will also show what employers must do to assure that the work can be done more safely. Employers have a responsibility to provide a safe workplace and required protective equipment. You'll see that using the right type of protection saves lives. Please be advised, the scenes you're about to see deal with deaths at construction sites and might be disturbing for some people. All scenes are based on true stories. 5 workers were putting a sewer pipe into the bottom of a trench with a ladder nearby to enter the trench. There was nothing in place to protect the workers inside the trench if the walls collapsed. While the workers were inside the trench, one side began to collapse. 2 workers were able to climb out using the ladder, but the other 3 workers were buried in the soil and unfortunately suffocated to death from the weight of the soil. Let's look at the events leading up to this tragic incident and see how it could have been prevented. Employers must follow OSHA rules to protect workers in trenches. However, here, the employer did not follow OSHA's rules, which led to these workers losing their lives. Let's go over the main points of OSHA's rules for trenches to see how to keep workers safe. All trenches must follow OSHA's rules. 1 cubic yard of soil can weigh as much as a car, nearly 3,000 pounds. So unless the trench is cut entirely into stable rock, protection against cave-ins must be used for all trenches more than 5 feet deep, or for any trench that shows signs of cave-in. Before workers can do any work in a trench, a competent person must conduct an inspection to identify and remove any potential hazards. A competent person is someone who can recognize hazards in the area and who has authority to take quick actions to eliminate the hazard, which may include temporarily stopping the work. Inspections must be performed at the start of every shift, after a rainstorm, or whenever conditions change. The competent person must also test the soil in a trench. OSHA requires at least 1 test by looking at the soil and at least 1 test by hand. If a person knows the soil types, they can pick the right protective system to keep workers safe when they're in trenches. OSHA classifies soil in a trench as stable rock, Type A, Type B, or Type C soil. Stable rock is the safest soil for a trench. Type A is the next most stable, and then Type B. And finally, Type C soil is the least stable. It's important to remember that trenches can have different types of soil based on depth and climate conditions. The competent person can choose from different protective systems for a trench, based on the types of soil found. For all trenches deeper than 5 feet deep, or for any trench that shows signs of cave-in, OSHA requires sloping, benching, shoring, or shielding to protect workers from cave-ins. Let's review each of these systems and then see how each one could be applied to the cave-in incident shown earlier. We'll look at sloping first. Sloping protects workers by cutting back the sides of the trench so the sides slant away from the trench. OSHA's rules identify the degree of slope allowed for each of the different soil types. When trenches are less than 20 feet deep, these are the basic maximum allowable slopes for each soil type. Stable rock can be vertical walls, but cannot be undercut. For Type A soil, OSHA requires that the walls be sloped 9 inches out for every 1 foot of trench depth. For Type B soil, OSHA requires that the walls be sloped 1 foot out for every 1 foot of trench depth. For Type C soil, OSHA requires that the walls be sloped 18 inches out for every 1 foot of trench depth. It's important to note that this kind of sloping can only be used for trenches less than 20 feet deep. Any deeper, and the protection must be designed by a registered professional engineer. So now, let's look at the workers in the original scene who were stuck in the trench as it started to cave in. But this time, the soil has been classified as Type B. The trench has been properly sloped, and the spoil pile is moved away from the edges of the trench. The trench walls are not caving in, and the workers are safe while they work. Now let's review the shoring type of protective system for trench workers. Shoring uses various support systems to prevent soil and the trench walls from moving. There are different kinds of shoring systems, but timber and aluminum hydraulic are the 2 basic types. Aluminum hydraulic cylinders are the most common type of shoring, and they are typically installed using spot bracing, plywood, or stacked methods. To install the shoring correctly, you must first determine the soil type. The type of soil and depth and width of the trench determine the maximum vertical and horizontal spacing used with the members of the shoring system. If we use our example of a 3-foot wide, 10-foot deep, 40-foot long trench in Type B soil, the shoring system being installed would need to include 12 strong aluminum vertical shores, with 6 on each side of the trench. These shores, also called rails, will be connected by hydraulic cylinders every 8 feet along the length of the trench. A hand pump pressurizes the hydraulic cylinders until they fit tightly within the rails. Now that the shoring's in place, let's look again at the workers in the trench at the beginning of the video. As before, the workers are laying a sewer pipe into the bottom of a trench. But now the shoring system prevents the trench walls from caving in and keeps the workers safe. Sloping and shoring are ways to protect the sides of the trench so they don't cave in. Now let's talk about shielding, which is a way to protect the workers when they're inside the trench. Shielding involves using trench boxes, also known as trench shields, or other supports to protect workers inside a trench from collapsing soil if a cave-in occurs. The competent person should pick a trench box that is right for the soil type and all other site conditions. A trench box has 2 large plates, which are held apart by 4 horizontal cross members. These plates, or shields, must be between the sides of the trench and the work area. The shields are strong enough to protect workers inside from a soil collapse. The shields can be 2 feet above the bottom of the trench as long as they can support the entire depth of the trench and there's no caving under or behind the shield. The top of the shield should extend at least 18 inches above the level of any materials that could cave into the trench. Trench boxes are typically used in open areas, but they can also be used with the sloping methods discussed earlier. So let's see how a trench box could have saved the workers that we saw at the beginning of the video. For our example, we'll assume that the workers are in a trench with type C soil and no sloping, but working inside a trench box. This time, as the workers lay the sewer pipe into the bottom of the trench, they are protected from any possible cave-ins. This example shows the importance of employers following OSHA's excavation standards to ensure that workers are provided with a safe workplace. These types of construction deaths are preventable. The trench cave-in prevention measures shown here save workers' lives. Use these protections on the job. It could be the difference between life and death. If you would like more information, contact OSHA at www.osha.gov or 1-800-321-OSHA. That's 1-800-321-6742.